Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to this August 30, 2014 edition of Nightcast. What an exciting night of news this is. Friends, when Mr. Herbert Armstrong was alive, one of God's apostles, God's initial candlestick for the end time ages, he saw things coming together in Europe such that he got excited to see, friends, it could be coming together, the things that are prophesied for the end time that lead up to the Great Tribulation, the fifth seal, the next major thing to happen in prophecy. Let me just put this chart on the screen real quickly for a moment. We're seeing the first four horses active: religious deception, war, famine, and the fourth seal, the pale horse, of whose rider is named Death, of plagues, pestilence, also seismic. That pestilence includes seismus, as Jesus Christ used the Greek word to describe commotions in the air, commotions on the ground of all kinds, and terake, trouble, literally troubled waters, figuratively mobs and seditions, and we're certainly seeing that kind of thing in the news. There's a lot of that tonight. But the one thing that was needed to bring these things Mr. Armstrong saw coming together would be a crisis, a real crisis. And there's more than one crisis that's happening. We've got the crisis in Ukraine, and we've got the IS, Islamic State crisis in the Middle East. This other thing related to Europe. And that's our opening story tonight. The story out of Europe, friends, relates to a crisis that, well, just listen to the world leaders themselves. The Lithuanian president says Russia is practically in a war against Europe. And then after she speaks, what do you hear what Putin has to say tonight?
I think the situation is worsening. Russia in open and direct involvement in and is at stage of war against Ukraine, and it is clear that means against country who wants to be closer to Europe. That means Russia is practically in the war against Europe, and that's we need to take into account, not hide anymore these kind of questions and take actions. And we need militarily to support and send military materials to Ukraine.
What kind of other actions, what kind of sanctions?
Of course, sanctions, full embargo, not only on future contracts on defense and military, but full now.
Now, friends, since we were on the air last Thursday night, a lot has happened. On this was a talk on Friday, and there was planning to get together the European leaders in Brussels, and it's not just talk about sanctions. But the lady you heard speaking here just now, this is the Lithuanian president, Dalia Grybauskaitė. And she, as you heard her, she said Russia is practically in a war against Europe. And so the EU leaders were gathering in Brussels this weekend to discuss the crisis in Ukraine. Now, they started out threatening to impose fresh sanctions against Russia. Russia denies that its forces are backing rebels who have been gaining ground on Ukrainian forces. And I'll have news to tell you how that voting came out in just a moment. But I want to turn us next, friends, to a video clip with Putin. I told you that he had a response. Putin says situation in Ukraine reminds him of Second World War.
You know, the situation sadly reminds me of the Second World War, when the German fascist occupants would surround our towns, such as Leningrad, and would shoot directly at the residential buildings and people. To this day, street signs from that time are still hanging on Nevsky Prospect, saying, "Don't walk on this side, it's too dangerous." This is horrible. It's a catastrophe. So I do understand the militias of Ukraine's southeast, Donetsk and Lugansk, why they call their operations military humanitarian. They're trying to push the Ukrainian artillery and rocket launchers away from the big cities so that they don't kill civilians.
Okay, friends, and that was Russian President Vladimir Putin, who you just heard him there, as the translator said, compared Ukrainian military tactics to those used by German Nazi forces during the Second World War invasion of the Soviet Union. He was speaking at an international youth camp in Western Russia. Putin blamed the Ukrainian government for the crisis. Now, interesting also, friends, is how this situation is engaging Germany into the equation. Germany, that for a long time wisely laid back following their unconditional surrender following round 2 of World War. After World War II, Germany wisely held back and just built their industry and got their economy and built up, and then after Russia took the wall down, after the USSR folded, then East Germany and West Germany, then they were able to reunite things and get the whole of Germany operative again, and now they got military in pretty much in place, and they're leading the thing in the EU. When this next news story comes out here, as I'm going to play for you next, where the EU agrees to Russian sanctions over military action, who's at the lead of this announcement but the head of Germany, German Chancellor Angela Merkel. She says that EU leaders have agreed, you'll hear her in a moment, the translator, have agreed there cannot be a military solution to the Ukraine conflict, and so the EU has decided to tighten sanctions on Russia. Here's the German Chancellor's comments.
Wir heute eigentlich nur zusammengekommen waren, diese Fragen zu entscheiden.
We met today in order to decide such issues. We also, however, talked about the current political situation. You probably know that we met President Poroshenko on the margins of this summit. He gave us a very moving account of the current situation there on the ground, namely that there is a very significant inflow of troops and material from the Russian side into Ukraine, into Ukrainian territory, which means that there is a significant escalation on the ground. At the same time, we said, and this is the view of all of the members of the European Council, that there cannot be a military solution to this conflict, and that is to say that all of our efforts must go towards keeping the channels of communication open and to try time and again, as President Poroshenko also pointed out, to bring about a mutually agreed ceasefire, and to also sort of throw our weight behind this by talking about the possibility of further sanctions. We said that should there be a further escalation, as we have actually experienced, we may need to take additional decisions. We mandated the Commission to prepare the ground for measures that can be taken, and they have to decide on that within a week. We will, irrespective of that, also address questions related to gas supply and questions related to the free trade agreement.
You know, and friends, following this now, Hollande, French President François Hollande has announced that the sanctions against Russia are not intended to be punitive. They are intended to invoke a resolution to the situation, since they don't want to see it go military. So they're trying to do sanctions to resolve it. That's what the French president said. And it's interesting, is it not, friends, how the leaders in Europe are represented by France and Germany, and it's creating another Franco-German alliance, which we've seen in the past several times, and then the result would be World War I and Germany against France, World War II, Germany against France. And hello, Brother Reuben, when are you going to wake up? You try to trust Germany and they stab you in the back every time, but here you are again with them. And I used to wonder, friends, when I would hear prophecy and for the future, and I'd wonder, well, how can France become involved with that again after being stabbed in the back twice, and why? I would wonder, why does France get so involved? Well, as you watch news, you see that. And why does France get involved with the EU? I used to wonder, why would they get involved with that uniting of Europe? Well, France is a big economy. It's a big economic part of Europe, and EU, without France in there, there'd be a big hole in the thing. And so, and it works for France, or France thinks it'll work for France. But I have video from Thursday, late Thursday, where French President Francois Hollande said that his words on Thursday, before they actually went ahead and passed the sanctions over the weekend, he said it would be unacceptable if Russian soldiers had entered Ukraine to support separatists. And let me play you his words, and then we'll discuss that. Here's that video featuring the French president speaking on Thursday, just a few days ago, Thursday.
Our continent is experiencing in Ukraine one of the worst crises since the end of the Cold War. This is France's position. Russia has to respect the sovereignty of Ukraine, stop its support to the separatists, and bring them to accept a bilateral ceasefire. Russia has to control its own borders effectively, and of course, if it were to be proven that Russian soldiers are on Ukrainian soil, this would be intolerable and unacceptable.
Now, I have some additional commentary related to what he said there. Mr. Hollande also said that Europe was facing one of the worst crises since the Cold War. The Ukrainian government says Russian forces have crossed the border, and a pro-Russian rebel leader in eastern Ukraine has said 3,000 to 4,000 Russian citizens are fighting in their ranks. Now, this Ukraine crisis, friends, it could indeed be the trigger that brings together the stories we played at the beginning of tonight's report. War, that Russia's going to make war with Europe, and Putin saying that, this sounds like World War II. Now, the outgoing president, he's still the commissioner over the EU, says we may reach the point of no return. Now, I'm speaking of European. Let me get the video lined up here. I'm speaking of. I'll give you his name in a moment as soon as I think of it, but. European Union foreign ministers have expressed concern at Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The European Commissioner President, Jose Manuel Barroso, called for a political solution before the crisis reached what he called a point of no return. He was speaking after talks with Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko. Now, let me give you a dateline for this. This is yesterday. This is a report from yesterday, Saturday.
We are in a very serious, I would say, dramatic situation. We may see a situation where we reach the point of no return. If the escalation of the conflict continues, this point of no return can come. I believe it's still not yet too late to find a political solution. I believe we should do everything we have in our capacity to avoid an escalation that will certainly be detrimental to the interests, first of all, of Ukraine, but certainly also of Russia and of Europe as a whole. We are working based on the principles, and we respect those principles. At the same time, it's our duty to call the attention of all those involved on the risks of further escalation.
And friends, we have next a report from Bridget Kendall related to the Ukraine that illustrates and points out how NATO is being asked by the Ukraine for help.
Ukraine's pro-Russian rebels are staging a comeback, and they're seizing back territory. The rebels say they're fighting on their own, but Ukraine says they've been reinforced by Russian troops and hardware. And Ukraine now needs NATO's help.
It is clear that NATO cannot support Ukraine with troops, and we do not expect NATO member states to do so. We can protect ourselves, but we need your assistance to stop aggression.
Till just a few days ago, the rebels in eastern Ukraine seemed to be on the back foot, forced out of their base in Slavyansk, their strongholds of Donetsk and Luhansk encircled. But then came reports of columns of Russian tanks and troops coming over the border, and now the fighting has spread south. Novoazovsk is apparently under pro-Russian control, and Ukrainian troops now fear an attack on Mariupol. But to involve NATO is dangerous. Look at Ukraine's long border with Russia. If NATO agreed to help protect it, it could start an all-out war with Russia, a nightmare scenario which throughout the Cold War NATO managed to avoid. As EU foreign ministers gathered today, tensions were rising.
These are Polish apples that President Putin says are poisonous.
A barbed joke from the Polish foreign minister, and tonight the Poles temporarily barred the Russian defense minister's plane from using Polish airspace. The Germans warned the crisis was slipping out of control. There's talk of tougher sanctions. NATO Secretary-General carefully did not rule out Ukraine being allowed to join the alliance.
Ukraine has decided to pursue a so-called non-alliance policy. We fully respect if the Ukrainian parliament decides to change that policy.
Meanwhile, President Putin still denies Russian troops are involved. He told a Russian youth forum Ukraine was the aggressor and reminded him of the Nazis. And it's unclear tougher sanctions would do anything except make him feel he had nothing to lose. Bridget Kendall, BBC News.
Okay, good report there by Bridget Kendall. I've got more information on this story, friends. Russia's President Vladimir Putin says any agreement to end the conflict in Ukraine must include discussions on giving more autonomy to pro-Russians in the East. His comments, of course, these were comments from today. They came after European leaders threatened to impose more sanctions if the Kremlin doesn't change its policy toward its neighbor. The Ukrainians have been sending in reinforcements to help defend the city of Mariupol in the southeast of the country, as separatist rebels who appear to have been backed by Russian troops are now threatening to attack the city. And I think I've got one more report on this with Richard Galpin.
Heading south through the countryside of eastern Ukraine, we spotted this trainload of heavy weapons destined for the port city of Mariupol. Around the city itself, Ukrainian troops are also digging trenches and strengthening their defences, to slow down any assault by the separatist rebels and their Russian backers. Despite the threat of an attack here, an act of defiance this weekend by these local people. A demonstration on the road leading to the front line.
We formed a human chain here to show the whole world, and in particular Mr. Putin, that we will not give up our city. If Mr. Putin wants to come to Mariupol, he will have to shoot innocent people, women and children.
These are very frightening times for the people here in Mariupol, and some have already been leaving, fearing the worst, that this important city could soon come under attack.
The separatist rebels, with its believed Russian troops, have in the past few days advanced to within 28 miles of Mariupol. The West has condemned the alleged Russian involvement in this new offensive, which threatens to turn the tide of the conflict, and the EU is now threatening more sanctions. But today, Mr. Putin raised the stakes further, hinting southeastern Ukraine could become a separate state.
We need to have immediate, meaningful talks, not just about the technical issues, but also on issues of political organisation and statehood in southeastern Ukraine.
No wonder then that this group in Mariupol was praying for the city this evening. They don't know if or when an attack may come, but if it does, it could be a devastating battle. Richard Galpin, BBC News, in southeastern Ukraine.
Friends, tonight's news has been so alarming in many ways that it got me a little off track. I forgot to play the break, the 20-minute break for those of you that watch on Facebook. Of course, if you hit the button that says watch more right at the top, as soon as that button pops up on Facebook, you can go over and watch the whole program on our archive, and rather than watch 20 minutes and then go to our archive and have to sit through the first 20 minutes again or use a little control to race on up ahead, just hit that button at the very beginning. But I didn't play our usual little we're taking a break thing, so I'll edit that in for the Facebook version after the program with this commentary that says the video that just played, you'll have to tune into the archive version to see that, because that was before they came on just at the 20-minute section. So we can't include that in the 20. Facebook limits us to 20 minutes. So what we just played, for those of you watching on Facebook, you'll have to tune in to the archive to see that story, along with the next one, which is regarding U.S. President Barack Obama and his much-cited commentary, "We don't have a strategy yet," regarding IS. That'll be in the archive version for those of you watching on Facebook, okay? Now, for the rest of you who are live with us, we will cover next this story related to President Barack Obama, and I don't have video on it, but I do have some head notes from today's news on this for you. President Barack Obama spoke a great deal about Syria, Iraq, and the Islamic State IS in Thursday's press conference. But these 6 words are dominating the non-beige suit-related discussion among U.S. politicians and pundits. The line was part of the president's response to a question about whether he needs Congress's approval to go into Syria. It seemed a frank admission that the administration is grappling with how to engage its military against rebel forces less than a year after it had all but decided to bomb the Syrian soldiers now fighting them. And then, the big story out of this is that the 6 words that the president said that have really been circulating in the news is that we don't have a strategy yet. We don't have a strategy yet. That's 6 words. We don't have a strategy yet. So that's from the United States POTUS, the President of the United States. POTUS being the abbreviation that people use when they're writing text messages and twittering and all of that. Friends, we got a story next related to Israel. Israel is to take over West Bank land. The caption under this picture in a news story today from the BBC says local Israeli settlements said they hoped to build on this land. Israel has announced plans to expropriate 400 hectares. That's the equivalent of about 1,000 acres, 988 acres to be exact, of Palestinian land in the West Bank. The decision to appropriate land south of Bethlehem is believed to be the largest seizure by Israel in 30 years. The military-run local administration said it was a response to the kidnapping and killing of 3 Jewish teenagers in the area in June. Palestinians said diplomatic action should be taken against Israel. The U.S. urged Israel to reverse. The U.S., that means, friends, that means Obama urged Israel to reverse the move. Now, another story we'll end on with tonight related to our Jewish friends is a video showing how Jews in Guatemala village are being forced to leave. Some 230 members of an Orthodox Jewish group have begun leaving a village in western Guatemala after a bitter row with the local neighbors, the local indigenous community.
A Mayan village in western Guatemala might seem a strange place to find a few hundred members of a small Jewish sect. But for a few months at least, the village of San Juan La Laguna was home to the members of Lev Tahor. A few had been there for several years, but since June had been joined by many more new arrivals from Canada. But now they're on the move again, after saying local people had threatened to cut off their water supplies.
Unfortunately, it went wrong, not from our side. In order to keep the peace, we decided we just have to leave. We have a responsibility for our children, for our women, for our families, and we don't want to live in a place that who knows what can happen. And even we have the full right to be there.
Village elders had accused the newcomers of refusing to mix or sometimes even speak to the other villagers and quarrelling with tourists. Lev Tahor are certainly a very individualistic group. They left Canada suddenly after being accused of child neglect, a charge they deny, and refusing to give up some of their children to the authorities. Religiously, they've condemned the State of Israel, believing that it shouldn't exist until the coming of the Messiah. Perhaps not surprisingly, Israeli media has taken against them, dubbing them the Jewish Taliban. The group now need to find themselves another home. For now, they've taken refuge in Guatemala City. John McManus, BBC News.
And friends, that's it for our Sunday night edition of Nightcast. God willing, and the creek don't rise. We'll be back again Monday evening with the day's current news related to the Bible and prophecy here on Nightcast. Until next time, your host, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth, saying good night, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on cogtv.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the cogtv.org video archive.